It's really my honor to be here, and I think before I'm going to delve into my presentation, I would just kind of like to say a few words about what this event is and why is it structured such as it is. We've thus far been calling this event the Digital Paideia, derived from the Greek word meaning knowledge or a society of knowledge. And I will admit this is a bit of a tradition that I ripped off from Reed, but basically at Reed we have a week at the end of January where anybody can teach a class on anything they like. And I thought now in this time when all of us are relatively cloistered within our own homes and kind of distant, now might be like a really excellent time for us to reach out from our places of relative isolation around a locus of something that we all share, which is philosophy. So without further ado, welcome to a brief introduction to phenomenology, aka hamster ball theory, as I like to call it internally, and I'm hoping that that's going to become apparent by the end of the presentation. So, part one, an age-old dilemma. It seems that we as human beings have been thrown kind of into a conundrum. It would appear, at least, that you are a conscious entity of some sort housed within your body in the world, right? And, you know, to most people, this is like, well, duh, but if you're a philosopher, this means cue the existential freak out. Because depending on how you choose to interpret this model, you're going to have a very different view of the world. What do I mean by this? Well, why don't we take a little trip through history to see how philosophers of the past have chose to interpret this problem. Okay, so part two, the recap. Let's start at the beginning of Western philosophy. We got like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, right? And the thing in vogue in ancient Greece is reason. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave, wherein he supposes that because our bodies, our soma, are fallible, we only experience the world as a series of impressions, and the truth of the matter lies in the realm of forms, which we can only access through our reason and our intellect. And even though Aristotle had a very conflicting view about how knowledge is acquired, I'm sure he would still agree that reason is the ultimate faculty of man. So in reassessing this model, if you're an ancient Greek person, chances are this is irrelevant. There are no perfect circles in nature, blah, rationalism. Use your head. And you know, this is a pretty convincing worldview. It sticks around for a bit and is very famously held by this guy on the left, Rene Descartes. But something interesting happens around Descartes' time. The scientific revolution happens. I'm going to talk a little bit about Copernicus, namely because he's the inspiration for Hume. We'll get to that. So this guy named Copernicus is like, hey, here's a radical idea. Why don't we test the theory that maybe the Earth is not at the center of the solar system? And, you know, it turns out that in this age of enlightenment, people are figuring out how to draw inferences and patterns from observable phenomena in order to make conclusions about their world. And this sparks kind of a new branch of philosophy, or at least a new team competing in the world of epistemology called empiricism. So here's now the way our model looks. What is the veil, you might be asking? It's relevant. Give me a sec. So this guy, John Locke, he kind of concluded that even if you want to doubt the actual ontological reality of the world external to you, you kind of have to acknowledge that there is a world external to you. And this is because, you know, if a dog jumps on your lap, that's something that is happening to you. That's not something you're initiating. So he proposes this model wherein there is an external world, but we have the veil constructed by the body in order to make sense of that world. So the debate between rationalism and empiricism pretty much goes like this. Everybody is trying to figure out what is the real a priori knowledge, what is the real like cornerstone of human thought. And of course, the rationalists are going to be like, ha ha ha, you know, you got to use your brain, a priori principles. And then you see if those principles fit within the world around you. But all the empiricists are like, yeah, but where'd you get the concept of numbers, dummy? Oh yeah, you probably saw that somewhere in the world. And then this debate kind of goes back and forth for an arbitrarily long time until this guy comes along. Many might recognize this guy as Immanuel Kant. And he was one day reading some Hume and he noticed something rather fascinating. He said, oh, Hume, your whole scientific method thing, as we know it, is only possible because humans experience linear time. And yeah, that is the story about how Kant revolutionized the field of physics. I'm absolutely kidding. He did not do that. But what he did instead was make a really interesting observation. We keep trying to circumvent the veil here, but maybe in order to do better science, we actually need to focus on the veil, the apparatus by which humans can come to any conclusion about the world at large at all, the mind, the faculties that humans use to make sense of things. And this is, of course, where Kant is going when he's writing Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Judgment. He's trying to analyze all these faculties that humans use to make sense of the world in order that we can do better science. And everyone's like, yay, Kant, Kant's amazing, woo, for a couple hundred years. And then this guy shows up and he's like, Kant's overrated. This guy's name is Edmund Husserl, and he's a mathematician turned philosopher. And he's reading Kant and he's really disappointed. He's like, Kant, my man, you really got the ball rolling. You were asking the right questions, but man, oh man, was your method sloppy. Like, for one, Kant's immediately jumping into these very big brain concepts like rational thought. But Husserl thought that you should probably start with something more basic. I don't know, like experiences, human intuitions, from which those very concepts of logic and judgment are derived to begin with. And moreover, Kant's whole theory kind of begs the question because it assumes this model of the universe to be true, whereas it should have been his object of study. He should have suspended it in disbelief. And this is the whole idea behind phenomenology, at least as Husserl tried to make it. The whole idea here is that you are trying to make a science out of observing your own consciousness and observing how the mind processes the world around it. So we start by sort of putting a pin in this concept, which is on the screen, you know, the dilemma. He calls this the natural attitude. And now the question is, what underlying structures of human thought are present such that we can experience the natural attitude as it is? In order to do this, he uses eidetic reductions on human phenomena and experiences. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with what an eidetic reduction is. It's essentially where you ask, how much can I change about this before it becomes something else? And he's performing this on multiple phenomena, almost like a mad scientist, but the lab is his own experience. And he believes that through this method, he is going to accurately map a sort of shape to the human consciousness, a few base characteristics to how we move through the world. And that, of course, is where we're going to get to right now. Although what you need to understand is that in phenomenology, it's all about the experience. Experience is the first thing. Well, what do we experience first? Let's start at the beginning. It seems the first thing we're experiencing is consciousness. Yes, we are conscious. And of course, if you want to debate that claim, then you've outed yourself as a philosophy zombie and you're no longer welcome in this lecture. All right, so you're conscious. What are you conscious of? That's an excellent question, because of course, when you're conscious, you can't be conscious of nothing. You're always conscious of something. That's a really important idea that the phenomenologists noticed. Okay, so you're conscious of stuff. Well, what kind of stuff? The stuff in your immediate vicinity, your world. And this is kind of where we get to point 2 of the important phenomenological descriptors, right? Because here's an interesting thing about how humans experience the world. Well, because our experience, the center and the locus of which is in our minds, which is housed in our bodies, and our bodies aren't like infinite things that span across the universe, across time and space. So our bodies, such as they are, have access to a very limited degree of information. And this is what the phenomenologists will call your life world. Your life world is kind of this weird, subjective bubble that you exist within. I like to think of the Pink Floyd lyric, all you touch and all you see is all your life will ever be, when thinking about this. But okay, cool. So we're a consciousness, we're in a body, we have this like vague life world that belongs exclusively to us. Now what? Well, now we're tasked with making sense of these experiences, right? We don't obviously perceive just raw sense data flooding into our brains, because if we did, oh boy, imagine the existential panic, we wouldn't be able to do anything. No. It just so happens, as the phenomenologists have pointed out, that our mind is very good at organizing things, making sense of the world so that we can experience it as we do. So that brings us to point 3. Semiotics. When I look at this pencil. What I'm seeing in essence is the pen, right? I don't see just matter conglomerated into a certain shape. No, my mind, the first intuition that it comes to is this is a pen. Martin Heidegger very famously gives an example with a hammer. You don't look at a hammer as a collection of matter in a specific form. You as a human tend to look at it as a hammer. And it's not until it breaks that you start to notice it as otherwise. So the world is organized semiotically. Well, how did we construct this weird schema for how to organize our world in a semiotic fashion? Well, we're relying on our past experiences of things. And this is also another point, which I think is really cool, the direction of consciousness. When you engage with something, when your consciousness is aware of something, it engages with it, right? It engages with it in what I like to call the 3 Fs, and this is of course a concept that's derived from Martin Heidegger. Here's an example. If I were to lay this pen down on the desk, I wouldn't expect it to magically start floating up. Your mind already has certain notions and preconceived ideas that allow it to make sense of the semiotic world such as it does. And according to Heidegger, there are 3 of them that will namely decide the orientation of your mind. There's facticity, there's what he calls thrownness, but I'm going to call it future just because I can have the 3 Fs, cool, and fallenness. So what is facticity? Facticity is basically the circumstances surrounding the thing, the information that you have been able to accumulate from within your life world prior to addressing whatever this is, be it an object, a person, an idea. Its thrownness or future is the potential that this object or thing has, which is why I obviously don't expect this pen to magically start levitating off of the desk. And the last one is fallenness. Fallenness is a really interesting concept because Martin Heidegger acknowledges that, hey, there are other people in this world. And for instance, if somebody were to tell me this is not a pen, this now changes the ontic validity of this pen for me. It's no longer a pen. It may be a laser pointer. It may be, a listening device that the government is using. I don't know. It could be a whole number of things. And you may wonder where I'm going with all of this. Well, now it's time to tie everything together in a neat little bow. Because if you were paying attention, one thing that's really interesting that you may have picked up on is that, 1, your experience of the life world informs you and your perception of the world. But, and here's the kicker, your perception of the world is also going to impact how that world manifests itself before you. In essence, you create your world and the world creates you. Mind blow, right? And I'm sure many of you guys saw Heidegger here and thought, when is she gonna get to Dasein? And this is where I get to Dasein. Because in essence, what this phenomenology tells us is that we're not necessarily just beings in the world. We are world beings. The whole world and you can, in a sense, be kind of considered one and the same thing, both perpetually influencing one another. That's whack. And this is where I start to like to call this hamster ball theory, because I think a really good way to visualize this is each one of us is like a consciousness, represented here by this stick figure, housed within a body. And this body limits access to the kinds of experiences that we are going to have. Remember, the life world is a product of the body. So we're all trapped in these hamster balls that are made of our life worlds and our own subjective experiences. And we're kind of just wandering around trying to make sense of things. That's mind-blowing, or at least I thought it was mind-blowing. You may think to yourself, well, this is all well and good, hunky-dory, but what now? Well, that's where we get to these 2 people. This is on the left Merleau-Ponty and on the right Alfred Schutz. They were particularly interested in, well, how is it exactly that we, as these weird prisoners of our life worlds, are able to form these really complex social structures and generally navigate the world in a surprisingly efficient way? And I could tell you what they said about those things, but I'm not gonna, because I don't think that's fun or particularly interesting. And also because I have a feeling that y'all out there listening to me talk through this computer screens are your own Daseins, your own world beings with your own life worlds, and your own opinions, hence informed by those life worlds about things. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we took advantage of that and, tried to figure this out together? I think that's pretty fun. So without further ado, I think we should break up soon into small discussion groups to break apart these concepts and play with them a little before we come back together and discuss our findings.
I was like very intrigued by your statement there, the humanities question mark.
Oh yeah. If we all have to digest, like if the humanities are a fundamental product of humans, I think it might be fair to ask, hey, how are the humanities also a direct product of the way humans make sense of the world? And if we made sense of it differently, I wonder how the humanities might be different.
I think another thing that affects, how the humanities would look is another one of the questions you have up there, which is how do we communicate across life worlds? Which, I mean, in essence, is just human language. But looking at, I guess, what phenomenology implies about human language is interesting. Like looking at that question, it made me think like there's this question in linguistics about like what is the limitation of human language? Is there such a thing that you could never express in human language? And I think from the phenomenological point of view, you could argue that the thing that you could never express in human language is an experience that would be solely unique to that, I guess, one being, which just is not a shared experience across multiple beings, because anything that can be expressed in language has to be some shared experience or some, I guess, shared understanding.
Or it has to reference something.
Yeah, I mean,
Schutz would say.
Yeah, that's I think a better way to put it. Yeah, so I think there's also the question of like, or I guess it also implies for anything in the humanities, it's also influenced by what are the things that we all perceive in common?
Mm-hmm.
Like what is the world that we think we all see together?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm reminded of William Desmond, the great philosopher at Leuven, his take in his book from like the early 2000s on art, origins, and otherness. I don't know if it's like a particularly unique take, like other philosophers have shared it, but basically the idea is after the death of God and after the death of metaphysics, we still have art. And by extension, we still have beauty. We still all, for the most part, experience it. Yeah, I was wondering, like, is there like a phenomenology of beauty going on in scholarship?
I hope so. That would be fascinating.
Yeah. But it seems like that could pave the way forward for like what you were saying about shared experiences that language can tap into. But there's also a sense in which those experiences transcend language and the innately reifying tendencies of language.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm most interested in is also, how can we tell if an existence is one that's shared or one that's purely unique to us? Because in essence, you can't ever know what the other conscious entity is thinking other than what they tell you in language. And that within itself.
Sort of like insert a quick tad note
Yes.
that I find fascinating. So a lot of these phenomenologists kind of recognize that, hey, we're talking about phenomena, raw sense experience. We kind of need a new language in order to do this, in order to convey things accurately. So many phenomenologists in the end just straight up abandon philosophical discourse and go straight to poetry. So Martin Heidegger, at the end of his career, really focused most of his work on stuff that would be considered prose poetry. And Gaston Bachelard, who wrote about the phenomenology of the household, very famously did so in what he called the poetic image. Fascinating, I think.
So I got a question about life worlds. I came in a little late, sorry. That kind of concept that we're kind of our own life worlds within ourselves combined with the world, and you and I are different life worlds, seems to kind of imply that you don't really share, or you don't have a way of knowing that you're sharing anything because we're this totally different world. And that seems a bit extreme, but maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
Well, I think that's a problem that's posed in phenomenology, and I think many phenomenologists would try to counter with their own ways of overcoming that problem. So we mentioned Schutz, for instance. He was really concerned with how do these vast social structures form out of individuals, and in doing so, much of his work is focused on breaking down how conversations work and how the semiotics of language works, so that's one way. But what I'm thinking of in particular, how do we transcend our own individual bubbles, is Martin Buber. Martin Buber very famously wrote, "Man lives his life twofold." There are two worlds, and I think what he was referring to, although very rudimentarily, was the concept of an objective world versus a pre-given life world. And he says that all real life is meeting. What does that mean? It's meeting in the places in between the life worlds, moments of encounter, where people no longer become part of our life world, an object within, but a Dasein in their own right. And it is in these very special moments when we can truly connect with the other. So that's one interpretation. I'd be very interested to hear your interpretation about how you think, in spite of the fact that we're all trapped here in our life worlds, we manage to form these very meaningful connections.
What can you define a Dasein? Because I think I missed that part.
Yes. So a Dasein, in German, Dasein literally means the being here. And in layman's terms, it would basically be a being that exists in the world and is aware of its own existence therein. But the concept is fundamentally tied to the notion that being and world are one and the same. You know, your existence creates the world, and the world as it is creates the way you experience it, your existence.
I don't know if this is just an initial shot at sort of how I might think about resolving this issue, is that somehow ourselves, whether that's our life world or our being or whatever, isn't simply taking in sense information and creating a world, but actually accessing objective truth from the world outside of us. Well, and including us. And that would be a way to overcome the problem of you and I never being able to know that we have anything shared, because we're actually able to access something that is by nature objective and therefore accessible by multiples and therefore shared.
That's interesting what you mentioned about objective truth, because I know that in a lot of like 20th century personalist philosophy, and then like in Levinas too, it was really the experience, like the phenomenological experience of the other, encountering the human other, that really reinforced our visceral sense of our responsibility to the other, and how really the other should not be treated as an object, but instead as always as a person, right? Of course, there's like the post-war context there driving a lot of that. But really it does come down to experience and not to, I think, rationality.
Yeah, I think my response, or at least one that Husserl might give, to the, we can all access something objective, is he says, yes, we may very well all be able to access something objective, but we can only do so through our subjective perceptual means.
Yeah, I would qualify what I said in that accessing objective truth wouldn't necessarily be like accessing it in its entirety completely, but that we have some level of access to it through our limited senses and our limited being. Yeah.
In which case I would totally agree.
So a number of people have asked questions in the Q&A. So Matt Bowman from Zephyr says, thank you, Maya. He has said something to the effect of, the world creates us and then we create the world. Also, this is similar to something we discussed in Ulrich, the talk on Ferdinand Ulrich last week, which y'all should check out. It's on YouTube. It's clear the two affect one another, but create seems like hyperbole here. Would you agree? And as you also mentioned later, there is a kind of ontology upon which experience must depend.
If this is a question posed to me, I guess what I would say is, you know, that one of the fundamental tenets of phenomenology is that there is an underlying structure to human experience. We wouldn't really be bothered with the pursuit of such a thing if it didn't exist. So this isn't completely to say that humans make up a world willy-nilly. I do think there are ways in which humans make sense of the world. And obviously you can't exactly, at least most normal people with normal modes of consciousness can't really will things into existence in reality, right? We can't all do the thing that Neo does in the Matrix where he goes, this is not a spoon, and it bends. And of course, when we do phenomenology and take those experiences for what they are, those might be some of the conclusions that we come up with. And then the obvious next step will be, okay, well, why don't we draw clear boundaries, define clear lines about what these structures actually look like?